Somewhere in the Pennsylvania countryside right now, there is a barn that has been standing for 200 years. It has held up tons of hay and grain and the weight of its own great roof through 2 centuries of blizzards and windstorms and the slow pull of gravity. And if you climb up into its loft and look at the joints where the huge timbers meet, you will not find a single nail holding the frame together. Not one. The entire skeleton of that building, beams as thick as a man's body and 40, 50, 60 feet long, is locked together with nothing but wooden pegs and the shape of the wood itself, cut so cleverly that the joints have only grown tighter as the years have passed. And here's the part that stops me every time. That barn was very likely raised. The whole towering frame of it stood up into the sky, in a single day, by 100 neighbors lifting the walls with their bare hands and long poles, while their wives laid out a feast on tables under the trees. I have spent a long time reading about how these barns were built, and 2 men keep coming back to me from the records. One is a master carpenter, a boss framer named Elias Gearhart of Jonestown, Pennsylvania, the kind of man who could look at a standing tree and see the finished joint. The other is an old man, a grandfather of 80. In one account I found a veteran barn builder who, when a young apprentice froze in terror after nearly dropping a heavy timber onto the crew below, simply hoisted a roof beam onto his own shoulder and called out, "Come on, let's go," and shamed the fear right out of the whole crowd. Those are the men this is about. The master framers who cut every joint by hand, and the neighbors who raised the walls in a day, and built barns that have outlived them by 2 centuries. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back, because this is the story of how a community with almost no money and no machines built some of the strongest and most beautiful wooden structures ever raised in America, out of nothing but timber, skill, and each other. To understand these barns, you have to understand the people who built them, and how much a barn meant to them. The great barns of Pennsylvania were raised mostly between about 1790 and 1900 by the Pennsylvania Germans, the people we often call the Pennsylvania Dutch. Though they were not Dutch at all, but German-speaking farmers who had come from the old country and settled the rich limestone valleys of Lancaster and Berks and the counties around them, beginning in the early 1700s. They brought with them from Europe a deep tradition of timber building, of framing great structures out of hewn wood locked together with joints, and they poured that tradition into their barns. And to these farmers, the barn was not a lesser building than the house. In many cases, it was the more important of the two. A family might live modestly in a small stone or log house and put their real wealth, their pride, and their finest craftsmanship into an enormous barn, because the barn was the engine of the whole farm. It sheltered the animals that pulled the plows and gave the milk. It stored the hay that kept those animals alive through winter, and the grain that was the family's cash and bread. A farm lived or died by its barn. So they built them to last not a lifetime, but for generations. And they were right to, because many of them are still standing. It is worth knowing who these people were, because their barns are really a portrait of them. The Pennsylvania Germans had come mostly from the Rhineland and the Palatinate, and from Switzerland, regions of the old country with long, sophisticated traditions of farming and of building in timber. Many had fled religious persecution and the endless wars of Europe, drawn to Pennsylvania by William Penn's promise of tolerance and by the extraordinary richness of the land. And the land they chose tells you how good they were at farming, because they sought out the deep limestone soils of the southeastern Pennsylvania valleys, some of the finest farmland on the entire continent, and they made it more productive still. They practiced careful crop rotation, they kept their fields fed and their livestock housed, and they became known fairly quickly as some of the best farmers in America. And the outward, physical sign of that success, the thing a traveler saw first from the road, was the barn. A great Pennsylvania barn announced that here was a serious, prosperous, permanent farm run by people who intended to be there in 100 years. The house might be plain, the barn was the statement. In the old saying that carries a real truth, the Pennsylvania German built a fine barn first and a fine house later, if at all, and housed his cattle better than some of his neighbors housed themselves. That was not foolishness. It was a clear-eyed understanding of where the wealth came from. The animals in the harvest were the farm's life, and the barn protected them, so the barn came first. When you understand that, the sheer scale and quality of these buildings stops being a surprise. These were not simple farmers throwing up a shed. They were skilled, prosperous, deeply rooted people, building the most important structure in their world, and building it to outlast them by generations. Now let me take you through how one of these barns was actually made, because the genius of it is in the details, and it starts long before any community shows up to raise the walls. It starts with a standing tree and a man with an axe. Before there were sawmills in every valley, and even after, the great timbers of these barns were shaped by hand, by a process called hewing. A woodsman would fell a huge, straight tree, an oak or a chestnut or a pine that had grown for a century or more, and then he would turn that round log into a squared beam, using nothing but axes and his own eye. First, he would score the round log along its length with an ordinary axe, cutting a series of notches down to the line he wanted. Then he would take up the broad axe, a heavy axe with a wide, flat blade sharpened on one side, and he would stand on the log or beside it and swing it in long, controlled strokes, splitting away the waste wood between the scores until he had a flat face. He would do this on all four sides, and where he wanted it smoother still, he would finish the surface with an adze, an ancient tool like a hoe with a sharp curved blade swung down between his own feet to shave the wood flat. When you look at the beams in an old barn today, you can still see the truth of this. The staggered, rippling marks of the broadaxe are right there in the wood, the fingerprints of a man who squared a tree by hand 2 centuries ago. To turn a single great log into a single great beam was hours of skilled, heavy, dangerous labor, and a barn needed dozens upon dozens of them. I want to dwell on that hewing for a moment because we have so completely lost any feel for it. Squaring a beam by hand is one of those skills that looks simple and is not. The broadaxe itself was a specialized tool, heavy, with a blade that could be a foot or more wide, sharpened flat on one face, so it would slice along the side of the log rather than bite deep into it, and often with a handle bent slightly to one side to keep the hewer's knuckles clear of the wood. A good hewer could stand alongside a felled log, snap a chalked line down its length, score the waste with quick chopping blows, and then walk slowly down the log, swinging that broadaxe in long, even strokes, splitting off the slabs of waste and leaving behind a face as flat and true as if it had been sawn. It took strength, but far more than strength, it took eye and control, a lifetime of feel for exactly where the blade would fall. And it was close, tiring, dangerous work. A heavy razor swung inches from the feet and legs all day long. Now multiply it. A single large barn might need dozens of massive posts and beams, some of them 40, 50, even 70 feet long, each one a whole tree that had to be felled, hauled, and then squared on all four faces by hand before a single joint could even be cut. The main girders were enormous. In one account, a single such beam was 18 inches square and 70 feet long, cut from one tree, a stick of timber so large that no tree alive in that country today could yield it. Before the barn raising that the neighbors remembered, before the feast and the crowd, there were weeks and months of a few skilled men out in a timber lot, turning a stand of ancient trees into a stack of perfect squared beams, one heavy swing at a time. The raising was the celebration. The hewing was the labor, and almost no one remembers it happened at all. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Then came the joinery, and this is the true heart of the whole thing, the reason these barns needed no nails. The Pennsylvania German framers, like the timber builders of Europe and Asia, going back thousands of years, joined their beams with the mortise and tenon. It works like this. On the end of one timber, the framer cuts a tenon, a tongue of solid wood, shaped and squared to exact size. In the face of the timber it must join, he cuts a mortise, a rectangular hole or socket, sized precisely to receive that tongue. The tenon slides into the mortise, wood into wood, and the two great timbers become one. But a tenon can slide back out of a mortise, so the framer does one more thing. He bores a hole straight through both the mortise and the tenon inside it, and he drives a peg of hard, dry wood down through that hole, pinning the joint shut. That peg, called a trunnel, a word worn down from tree nail, is the only fastener in the entire connection, and it is made of wood. And here is the quiet brilliance of it, the thing that makes these joints better than nails, not worse. The framer would use green, slightly damp timber for the beams, but bone-dry, seasoned wood for the pegs. As the years passed, the great green timbers slowly dried out and shrank, tightening down hard around the dry pegs, which did not shrink. So the joint did not loosen with age the way a nailed joint does. It got tighter. A well-cut mortise and tenon joint, pinned with a good peg, is stronger a century later than the day it was made. The builders knew that metal was expensive on the frontier, and worse, that iron nails would rust and stain and eventually rot the wood around them and fail. Wood locked to wood would do none of that. It would simply hold and go on holding for 200 years and counting. They were not building without nails because they were poor and could not afford them. Or not only that, they were building without nails because their way was better. And there was a refinement in their joinery so clever that it is still taught with something close to reverence among the few who practice this craft today. I told you the framer bored a hole through the mortise and the tenon and drove a peg through to lock them. But the best framers did something sly with that hole. When they bored through the tenon, they would set its hole just slightly off, a small fraction of an inch closer to the shoulder of the joint than the matching holes in the mortise around it. Then when they drove the hard peg through, the peg could not run straight. It had to bend its way through the offset holes, and in doing so it dragged the tenon deeper into the mortise and pulled the whole joint up tight, clamping the two timbers hard together with a force that would never let go. This trick is called draw boring, and it meant the framers did not need clamps or heavy weights to close their joints. The peg itself pulled them shut and held them shut, permanently. It is the kind of quiet, invisible cleverness that runs all through this craft. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of building in wood, carried across an ocean and applied here by farmers in a new country. The pegs themselves were split, not sawn, from straight-grain dry hardwood, usually oak, so their fibers ran unbroken down their length and they could take the strain without snapping, and they were shaved to a slight taper and driven home with a heavy mallet until they rang. Every one of the hundreds of pegs in a great barn was made by hand, driven by hand, into a hole bored by hand with an auger, through a joint cut by hand with a chisel and a mallet. There is not one machine anywhere in the entire structure. There is only wood and edge tools, and an enormous amount of human skill. And it is worth naming the tools, because there were not many of them, and that is the point. To build one of the strongest structures in early America, the framer needed a felling axe and a broad axe and an adze to shape the timber. He needed augers, hand drills turned by main strength, to bore the peg holes. He needed a set of chisels and a heavy wooden mallet to cut and pare the mortises and tenons clean. He needed a framing square and a level and a plumb bob and a chalk line, and a scribe to lay out his cuts. And he needed a way of measuring, though the oldest method barely needed even that. In the earliest tradition, called scribe rule framing, the framer laid each pair of timbers together and marked each joint to fit its exact partner and no other, which is why every joint had to be numbered, because no two were interchangeable. Later, many framers moved to what is called square rule, a cleverer system in which each timber was cut to a standard reference so the pieces became more interchangeable, a small early step toward the mass production that would eventually swallow the whole craft. But whichever method he used, the framer's kit was a bag of hand tools a man could carry on his own back. There was no shop full of machinery, no power, no engine. The entire art lived in the edge of a few steel tools, and in the trained hands and eye of the man swinging them. That is worth sitting with. Some of the largest and most durable wooden buildings ever raised in this country were made with a toolkit simple enough to sling over one shoulder, by men who carried the rest of what they needed inside their own heads. Once the framer understood his design, the real solitary work began, and it could take months. A great barn was built as a series of what are called bents. A bent is one complete cross-section of the barn's frame. A single flat wall of heavy timber, posts and beams and angled braces, all joined together, that when stood upright forms one of the ribs of the building. The master framer, a man like Elias Gerhardt, would lay out and cut every one of these bents flat on the ground, fitting each mortise to each tenon by hand, testing them, adjusting them, until the whole bent fit together perfectly. And because a large barn had many such bents and hundreds of joints, and because every joint was unique, the framer marked each matching pair with a system of cut numbers, Roman numerals chiseled into the wood, a 1 near a tenon and a matching 1 near its mortise, a 2 and a 2, and so on, so that on raising day there would be no confusion about which piece met which. Then, having proved that every bent fit, he would take them all apart again and stack the numbered pieces in order, ready. All of that, weeks and months of a skilled man's life cutting and fitting timber alone in a yard, happened before the barn raising that everyone remembers. The community raised the walls in a day, but one master framer had spent a whole season preparing for that day. Think about the mental work in that, quite apart from the physical. The master framer was holding an entire three-dimensional building in his head and translating it, joint by joint, into cut timber with no power tools and often no formal drawings, working instead from a system of proportion and measurement carried in his memory and his tools. He had to know, before he cut a single mortise, exactly how every piece would meet every other piece, how the loads would travel down through the frame to the ground, how the whole thing would go up on raising day in the right order without a half-raise bent, trapping a timber that should have gone in earlier. He had to cut hundreds of joints so that they would all come together, weeks or months later, in front of 100 watching neighbors, without a single one being wrong, because a mortise cut in the wrong place could not be uncut. This is why the framer was a respected and well-paid specialist, and why a farmer would seek out and hire the best man he could find, the way one account describes an owner wanting the finest timber framers and masons and ironworkers money could get. The raising looks like the achievement, because it is dramatic and public and full of people. But the raising was only possible because one careful man had already solved the entire puzzle in advance, alone, in a timber yard, over a long season of work that no crowd ever gathered to watch. The genius was cut into the wood before anyone showed up to lift it. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Because now we come to the day itself, the barn raising, one of the most extraordinary community events in American history, and it deserves to be seen clearly. When the timbers were all cut and numbered and the foundation was ready, the word went out through the neighborhood, and on the appointed day the community came. Not a work crew, the community. In one account I found of a raising, more than 100 men gathered at a single farm to put up one barn. They came because that was the deal that held these farming communities together. You came to raise your neighbor's barn, and when your day came, he and everyone else came to raise yours. No money changed hands. The labor was the currency, and it bound the whole valley together. The men would take the first great bent, lying flat on the ground with its base at the edge of the foundation, and they would begin to lift. Some heaved directly on the timber. Others used long pike poles, poles of tough wood around 12 feet in length, tipped with an iron point, which they set against the rising frame to push it higher as it went up, past the reach of their arms. And slowly, with dozens of men straining together, that huge wall of timber would rise up off the ground, tilting up and up, until it stood vertical against the sky, and men rushed to pin its base and brace it while others held it steady. Then they did it again with the next bent and connected the two standing ribs with the long horizontal timbers, the plates and girts, tying the skeleton together. Bent by bent, the barn rose, until by the end of the day a frame that had been a stack of numbered timbers in the morning stood complete and towering over the farm. And all around that rising frame was something more than work. A barn raising was one of the great social events of the rural year, a rare and welcome break in the hard, isolated grind of farm life, and the community treated it as such. While the men raised the frame, the women of the neighboring farms, the wives and the daughters, were preparing an enormous feast, and when the heavy work was done, everyone sat down together at long tables, set up out in the yard, under the trees, and ate the kind of abundant, hearty meal the Pennsylvania Dutch were famous for. Dish after dish of it, more food than anyone could finish. There was often cider, and sometimes stronger drink, and there were children everywhere running underfoot, watching their fathers and grandfathers do something spectacular, learning the craft by watching the way it was always passed down. There was pride in it and a bit of competition, crews taking quiet satisfaction in how fast and how cleanly they could get a frame up, an old man like the grandfather in my account measuring the day against the dozen or more raisings he had worked in his long life. It bound people together in a way that is genuinely hard for us to imagine now. These families lived scattered on their own farms, often a hard walk or ride apart, working from sunup to sundown. The barn raising brought the whole valley into one yard for one day, to do something none of them could do alone, to eat together, to court and gossip and settle the news, and to renew the unspoken contract that held the whole community up. You raise my barn, I raise yours. When your turn comes, we will all be there. It was insurance and economy and church, social, and construction crew all folded into a single day that ended with a new building standing where the morning had held only a stack of numbered wood. There has not been much like it in American life since, and I think we are the poorer for its passing. There was a harder edge to the day too, tucked in beside the feast, and it is part of the honest picture. Whiskey and hard cider flowed at many raisings, and the mix of strong drink, great heights, and tons of swinging timber was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Some communities, especially the more devout, kept their raisings dry for that reason, understanding that a drunk man on a rising bent was a threat to everyone below him. And even sober, the work took its toll. Men fell from the frames. Timbers slipped. Bents got away from the crews. Across the long history of barn raising in this country, men were crippled and men were killed doing this, and the accounts of individual raisings often carry a note of a near miss, a dropped beam, a man carried off to bed or to his grave. That was the price of doing something this big with nothing but human muscle and cooperation. And yet they kept doing it, year after year, farm after farm, because the alternative, a family trying to raise a great barn alone, was simply impossible. The danger was real, and they accepted it, the way they accepted everything else about a life lived close to hard physical work and sudden accident. The barn raising was a gift the community gave each of its families in turn, and like most real gifts, it cost something to give. Directing all of it, usually from an elevated spot where he could see everything, stood the boss carpenter, the master framer, with a plumb bob, a weight on a string, held between his thumb and finger to check that every post was going up perfectly vertical. He called the moves, often in Pennsylvania German, with hand signals and shouts, telling the men when to lift, when to hold, when to push with the poles, when to pin. On his judgment rested the lives of every man near that rising frame, because there was nothing casual about the danger. Let me be honest about that danger, because it was real and it was severe. A bent was an enormous mass of heavy timber, and while it was being lifted, in that long moment when it was neither flat on the ground nor safely upright and pinned, it was a killer waiting to happen. If the men lost control of it, if too few were pushing, if a pole slipped or a rope broke, that whole wall of timber could come crashing back down onto the men below, or fall outward and take men with it. In the account I keep returning to, an apprentice carpenter up on the frame lost his grip on a roof timber, a beam 6 inches square and 8 feet long, and it fell toward the workers below and only just missed them, and the young man froze, paralyzed by what he had almost done. And it was then that the old grandfather, the veteran of a lifetime of raisings, picked up a heavy roof beam, swung it up onto his own shoulder as if it were nothing, and called out for the boy to come on and get back to work, breaking the spell of fear with sheer calm example. Men were hurt and killed at barn raisings across the years. It was joyful, it was communal, it was a feast and a celebration, and it was also tons of timber going up over people's heads by muscle alone, and everyone there knew it. And the framers were not the only skilled hands on these barns, though they are the ones I keep returning to. The lower level of a bank barn, the part dug into the hillside where the animals lived, was very often built of stone. Thick walls of local fieldstone or limestone laid up by masons, and a good barn wanted good masons as much as it wanted a good framer. One account of a fine barn describes the owner deliberately hiring the best timber framers and the best masons and the best ironworkers he could find, because he wanted to make a statement that would stand for generations. So around the master framer gathered a whole set of trades. There were the masons who raised the stone foundation and the lower walls. There were the men who split and nailed the siding, and the roofers who covered the whole thing over once the frame was standing. There was, sometimes, a smith to make the few iron fittings the building did use, the hinges and the hardware for the great doors. A finished Pennsylvania barn was the combined work of many kinds of skilled labor, stone and timber and iron, all brought together on one hillside to make a single building meant to outlast everyone who touched it. And it usually did outlast them. That was always the point. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And I have not even told you yet what made these particular barns so clever beyond the joinery, because the Pennsylvania barn has a distinctive shape that was itself a piece of brilliant practical design. Most of these great barns are what we call bank barns, and the name is literal. They were built into the side of a hill, into a bank of earth, so that the building had two full levels, each with its own ground-level entrance from a different side of the slope. On the lower level, dug into the cool of the hillside, were the stables for the animals. Up above, reached by a ramp on the high side of the bank, was the great threshing floor and the mows where the hay and grain were stored. A farmer could drive a loaded wagon straight in on the upper level from the high side of the hill and tend his animals on the lower level from the low side, all without a single machine, using the natural slope of the land to do the lifting for him. And on the downhill side, the upper level of the barn projected out past the wall of the lower level, overhanging it, a feature the Pennsylvania Germans called the forebay, sometimes overhanging by 6 feet or more. That forebay sheltered the animal doors and the barnyard below from rain and snow, and gave more storage above. It is the signature of these barns, that great overshooting front, and it was pure function. The whole design shaped by the land and the weather and the daily work of a mixed farm, worked out over generations into something that also happens to be beautiful. The roots of that design reach back across the ocean, which is why one of the main types is called the Schweitzer barn, from the German word for Swiss. The bank barn, the two-level barn built into a hillside, came out of the mountainous farming country of Switzerland and the German-speaking Alpine regions, where farmers had long since learned to let a slope do their lifting for them, and the Pennsylvania Germans brought that knowledge with them and found, in the rolling limestone hills of Pennsylvania, the perfect ground to use it. Every part of the design earns its place. The animals lived on the lower level, banked into the hillside, where the earth kept them cooler in summer and warmer in winter and sheltered from the worst of the weather. The threshing floor and the hay mows sat above, where the crop stayed dry and where a loaded wagon could be driven straight in from the high side of the bank and unloaded with gravity's help, and where the winter's hay lay directly over the animals that would eat it. So feeding them was partly a matter of dropping fodder down through the floor. The forebay, that great overhang on the downhill side, sheltered the animal doorways and a strip of the barnyard from rain and snow, and gave the beasts a dry place to stand, while adding storage room above, without adding a single post below. Even the manure had its logic, gathered on the lower level and carried out to feed the fields that grew the next crop, that filled the mows, that fed the animals that made the manure. A closed loop of fertility these farmers understood and managed with great care. The barn was not just a big building. It was a machine for running a mixed farm, every feature of it shaped by the daily reality of animals and crops and weather and the slope of the land, refined over generations until it reached a kind of perfection of form and function together. That it is also, from a distance, one of the handsomest buildings in the American landscape is almost a side effect. They were solving a problem. Beauty was what happened when they solved it well. It also helps to know what actually happened inside these barns, because the whole design was built around the work. The heart of the upper level was the threshing floor, a wide, strong, smooth floor of heavy planks running between the great doors. And in the years before threshing machines, this was where one of the central labors of the farm year took place. The harvested grain, the wheat and rye and oats, was brought in and spread on that floor, and the farmers threshed it, beat the grain loose from the straw by hand with a tool called a flail. 2 sticks, joined by a leather hinge, swung down again and again to knock the kernels free. Then they winnowed it, tossing the beaten grain into the air, often in the draft between the 2 open barn doors, so the breeze carried off the light chaff and let the heavy grain fall back to the floor. The barn's whole shape served this. The great doors on both sides of the threshing floor were placed to catch the wind for winnowing. The mows to either side held the hay and the unthreshed sheaves. The animals below turned the hay and grain into work and milk and meat and manure, and the manure went back out to the fields. Standing empty today, a great barn can look like just a huge shed, but it was nothing of the kind. It was the workshop and the storehouse and the beating heart of the entire farm, a building designed down to the placement of its doors around the daily and yearly rhythms of getting food out of the ground. Every beam that framer cut was cut in the service of that work. The endless, seasonal, life and death work of feeding people and animals through another year. When the frame was up and the roof was on, and the siding was nailed to the outside, the barn was finished. And often the family would set into the masonry of the wall a date stone, a carved stone recording the year the barn was built, and the initials or names of the owners, sometimes with a blessing or a carved star. On one Pennsylvania farm, the date board carries the year 1819, and the names of the couple it was built for, Samuel and Maria Kistler, along with a six-pointed star. Those painted stars, the ones people came to call hex signs, and the carved date stones, are part of what makes these barns so distinctive and so loved. But notice what the date stone records. It records the owner, the family, the year. It almost never records the master framer who cut every joint, or the 100 neighbors who raised the walls. The stone remembers who the barn belonged to. It forgets who built it. Those date stones and painted stars deserve a word of their own, because they are so bound up with how we picture these barns. The carved date stone set into the gable or over a door, giving the year and the owner's initials and sometimes a short blessing, was a way of marking the barn as a family's achievement and a family's property, fixed in stone for the generations to come. And on the gable ends of many barns, especially in certain counties, the Pennsylvania Germans painted the great colorful geometric stars and rosettes that outsiders came to call hex signs, a name that hinted at magic and witchcraft. The folklorists and the descendants themselves will tell you the truth is simpler and, I think, better. For most of the people who painted them, the stars were decoration, folk art, an expression of pride and identity, and a plain love of color on the biggest blank surface a farmer owned, which was the broad wall of his own barn. They marked the building as belonging to a particular people with a particular heritage. They were the signature of a culture, if not of the individual hands that did the work. And that is the quiet irony that keeps pulling at me. The barn is covered in marks of identity, the date stone with the owner's name, the star that says whose people built this, the whole building announcing that it belongs to somebody. And yet the one identity it almost never records is the identity of the master framer and the crew who actually turned the trees into this standing thing. The barn remembers everything about who owned it and almost nothing about who built it. Rehook the mind onto the sheer endurance of these things for a moment, because it is the best argument for everything I have told you. We build now with steel nails and screws and pressure-treated lumber and engineered beams, and our ordinary buildings are lucky to last 50 years before something has to be torn out and replaced. These barns, framed by hand with wooden pegs by farmers who had never heard the word engineer, routinely stand for 200 years and more, their joints still tight, their hewn beams still sound. They have become so valuable in their endurance that today there is a whole trade in carefully taking down old Pennsylvania barns that can no longer be maintained and salvaging their massive hand-hewn timbers, beams that cannot be bought new at any price, because the old-growth trees they came from no longer exist, to be reused in new homes. The work of those anonymous framers is now worth more, board for board, than almost anything a modern mill can produce. But that same endurance has become a kind of slow tragedy in our own time, and it is worth being honest about it. These barns were built for a way of farming that has largely vanished. The small, mixed family farm, with its horses and its hand labor and its need for great mows of loose hay, has given way to machines and specialization, and a 200-year-old bank barn, magnificent as it is often simply the wrong shape and size for modern agriculture. So, across Pennsylvania and the whole region, these barns are being lost. Some fall to development, torn down so the land can be built on. Some collapse slowly from neglect, when a farm can no longer afford to keep up a building it no longer uses. Every year, there are fewer of them than the year before. The trade in salvaging their timbers is in part a rescue and in part a symptom, a sign that the barns themselves are dying even as the wood in them proves nearly immortal. There are people fighting this, preservationists and historians and farm families determined to keep their barns standing. And I'm glad of them, because when one of these barns comes down, something goes with it that cannot be rebuilt. Not just because the old-growth timber is gone, though it is, but because the skill is gone, the whole living tradition of the master framer who could hold a barn in his head and cut it by hand. We could, with great effort and expense, build a new timber-framed barn today, and a few devoted craftsmen do exactly that. But we cannot casually raise one in a day with 100 neighbors who all know how, because that world, the world that made these barns ordinary, is gone. Each surviving barn is a message out of it, and every one we lose is a letter from that world that will never be read again. These barns were not confined to Pennsylvania either, though that is where the type was perfected and where it is most closely identified. As the Pennsylvania Germans and their descendants moved, they carried the barn with them, south down the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, west into Ohio and beyond, and north into Ontario in Canada, seeding the Great Bank barn across a wide stretch of the continent wherever the land and the farming suited it. It became one of the signature farm buildings of a whole region of America, so common in some counties that people stopped seeing how remarkable it was, the way you stop noticing anything you pass every day. A few of them have been recognized for what they are, preserved as historic landmarks, cared for and studied, standing now not as working farm buildings but as monuments to a way of building and a way of life. But the truest monuments are the thousands of ordinary ones still standing along the back roads, unmarked and unremarked, still holding hay, still sound, still doing quietly what they were built to do 2 centuries ago. You do not need a plaque to read them. You only need to go inside and look up and understand what you are seeing. And when you do look up, there is more to read than you might think, if you know the marks. Those Roman numerals the framer chiseled into each joint are still there in the old wood, his private code for which piece met which, a 1 still facing a 1, a 5 still facing a 5, the record of the man's planning left, right where he cut it 2 centuries ago. You can see the rippled scallops of the broadaxe down the faces of the great beams, the trace of a hewer's strokes, no 2 men's quite alike. You can find, at the ends of the pegs, the slight bend, where a drawboard peg was forced through offset holes and is still, after all this time, pulling the joint tight. You can read the whole logic of the building in its bones, the loads coming down through the posts, the braces fighting the wind, the plates tying it all together. It is, in its way, a text, written in wood by men who mostly could not have imagined that anyone would ever want to read it. They were not making art or leaving a message. They were building a barn that would work and would last. But in doing it as well as they did, with that much skill and that much care, they left behind something a person can still stand inside and understand, and be moved by, long after their own names have vanished. The barn is the message. The men are the meaning. I keep thinking about the shape of a raising day, start to finish, as a picture of a whole way of life. In the morning there is a stack of numbered timbers on the ground, and a foundation waiting. There is one master framer who has spent months of solitary skill preparing every joint. There are 100 neighbors walking in from the surrounding farms, and their wives and daughters setting up long tables under the trees. And then, in the space of a single day, by nothing but shared muscle and one man's careful design, a great building stands up out of the ground where there was none, and everyone sits down together to a feast in its shadow. No money, no machines. No contractor but a neighbor. Just skill and timber and the plain understanding that you raise my barn and I will raise yours. And the thing they built that day is very likely still standing right now. That is what I want you to hold on to. The next time you pass one of those great overshooting Pennsylvania barns along a country road, weathered gray or painted red, with a faded star on its gable, understand what you are looking at. You are looking at a building with no nails in its bones, cut by hand by a master whose name the date stone did not bother to keep, and raised in a single day by 100 men whose names are gone entirely. The owner is remembered in the carved stone over the door. The men who actually built it, the framer with his plumb bob and the neighbors with their poles, left their work standing for 2 centuries and their names nowhere at all. When I stand inside one of those old barns and look up at a mortise and tenon joint still locked tight after 200 years, I feel like I am looking at a signature after all, not a name. Just the proof, in wood, that someone who knew exactly what he was doing stood in that spot a very long time ago and did it right and meant it to last. And it has. That is a kind of monument too, I think, quieter than a carved stone with a name on it, but in some ways truer. A date stone can only tell you who a man was. A joint that is held tight and true for 200 years tells you what he could do, which is surely the thing he would most have wanted remembered. The name is gone. The skill is still standing, still working, still holding up the roof over another farmer's hay. Of the two, I am not certain the name is the greater loss. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.